Well, hello everyone, and welcome, and thank you so much for coming along this evening. My name is Marcus Gilroy-Ware, and I convene the SOAS Digital Research Network. And I'm very happy to be here to be moderating the discussion of this fantastic project, which we're going to be hearing more about. Divergent discourses, which, processes for narrative construction, Tibet. And as we'll see, it's a project that really ties together so many different considerations on, not just on Tibet, but on different kinds of research and different relationships to knowledge. And I think we're going to have a really interesting discussion. So I have a lot to say about it, but I will keep most of my remarks for the end after we've heard from Robbie and Xaver. But I'd like to introduce both of our speakers. So from the University of Leipzig, the primary investigator for the German-funded side of the study, we have Professor Franz Xaver Erhard from the Institute of South and Central Asian Studies. And then from SOAS, we have Professor Robbie Barnett, who is the PI for the sort of British-funded side of the project. And I could give you their whole bios, but we're going to try and keep this relatively informal. So I think without further ado, actually, I'm going to pass over to you both. Is there one of you who would like to speak first? Or?
I think I'm going to kick off.
Okay.
Thanks. Well, I'm Robbie Barnett, as Marcus said. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. Firstly, can you hear me? Is it okay? We're not using the mic because of echo problems. I'm the sort of SOAS UK part of this project. It's a joint project funded by AHRC in the UK and DFG in Germany, 3-year project. And we're allied with this Berlin State Library, who will be putting a lot of our materials online when we finish. Well, I'm going to begin by raising some of the kind of question marks that we're interested in that lead us to design this project. And it's partly a result of the peculiarity or the particularity of the Tibet research problem, which is that this problem actually has been a problem for studying Tibet for many decades, maybe even longer, but it's now becoming a problem for many parts of the world. And that's the problem of access denial, the problem of somehow not working here. There we go. Yeah, the problem of access denial, the problem of doing research about a place to which a researcher cannot go. This has been the case in Tibet for a long time. There are researchers who've been allowed to work in Tibet. Of course, Tibetans and Chinese researchers can, but they have extraordinarily tight limits on what they can do, what they can write about. And foreign researchers have become more and more restricted in their permission to work in Tibet. And in particular, access to archives for historians has become more and more unusual. There were a couple of cases when some foreign researchers were allowed archive access, but it was very brief. The agreement collapsed very quickly, and it hasn't been renewed with anyone else. So basically, Tibet is an area where foreigners can't go, or foreign researchers can't go. Very few Tibetans are allowed to travel out from Tibet, and for historians, the archives are not accessible. So this leaves us with a fundamental question: what materials, as researchers, as historians, and as analysts, can we draw on in order to make our analysis and to answer our questions? And that's what leads us to newspapers. If we look back at written materials from within Tibet over the past 60, 70 years, or actually even longer, it's really only newspapers that remain as public printed documents that we can turn to. Newspapers, of course, are not archives. They're not the government's internal records of its decision-making. Often they're not regarded as primary documents. They're in a sense secondary, but they're the closest we have in this field to a primary document. But then they present their own special problem that all of us are familiar with, which is newspapers, particularly in China, are essentially propaganda vehicles. They're about persuading people. They're not about producing news or providing information, except limited category of information. They're about persuading people about the positive benefits of the ruling party, the government, and so on. This is true, I suppose, with many kinds of newspapers around the world, but with the party's newspapers in China, that's a declared purpose. Newspapers are organs of the party, so they're very, very rich, very dense in a kind of propaganda aspect of their work. That makes them, tends to cause outside analysts to dismiss them as sources. So that's the first major problem that comes up when we deal with newspapers. It's the critics who say, you can't get any news from a newspaper. You can't get primary information. So that leads us really to the design of this project, which is the possibility that two particular methodologies can help us discover value in the propaganda-heavy vehicle of a newspaper, particularly inside Tibet. Those two methodologies, one very obvious, one probably very familiar to most of you. The first one is comparison, comparative approach, comparing, in this case, newspapers produced inside Tibet with their propaganda for the party, essentially, and the state, the new Chinese state after 1949, and comparing that with newspapers produced outside Tibet in the exile community, mainly in South Asia, by that community after some 80,000 Tibetans fled to South Asia, mainly India and Nepal, in 1959, after the failure of a number of uprisings against Chinese rule in different parts of Tibet. So that exile community has its own newspapers, and by comparing those newspapers, which of course reflect the ideals and the wishes and the arguments of the different parts of the exile community, comparing that with the ones inside Tibet, we have a potential route for discovering overlaps and discovering differences between the two forms of representation, the two forms of documentation of events at the time. So that's the first method, the comparative method. The second tool that we're deploying here to mine our newspapers is, of course, the set of digital tools, digital humanities tools, text mining, big data, corpus analytics, and so on. And we're going to give you some more examples of that Xaver will give you later. But very roughly, we can categorize what the possibilities are of those tools with our kinds of materials in two rough ways. The prosopographic approach, that we can also call that the grains of sand approach. With big data, you can develop tools that will find hundreds or thousands of references to certain names, certain locations, certain institutions, that then you can align with times, dates, maybe people, and so on. And that can sometimes lead you to be able to detect patterns, essentially of association between certain groups of people, and perhaps between those people and certain places or certain ideas. So then you can construct networks, diagrams of patronage groups, maybe even political factions. So that's one area of possibility that we'll be looking at. The second, though, is the main focus, the main objective we have that we're pretty sure we can find with these tools, which is discourse mapping, looking at different discourses. So here we're thinking of discourse, not exactly in the Foucauldian sense, but and not in the sense of discourse analysis, that's a slightly different application, but in the sense of a narrative, a framing of events in a particular way to support some kind of argument, very often to support some kind of emotional framing of a particular set of events. So that's what we mean by a discourse, a kind of narrative agglomeration of explanations for a certain part of a historical process. But we're very interested in how discourse has been theorized over the last few years. And in one theorist called Todorov, he distinguished between two levels of narrative construction, of discourse in this sense. One is the discourse level. That's the level that we're probably all familiar with when you see the ornamentation progressively, often gathering more and more additions to its own presentations of a story over time. That are often written about. We have many scholars in Tibetan studies field, those of you who know Melvin Goldstein, John Powers, they're people who focused on the discourse level of Tibet narrative, historical representation, presenting, for example, the Chinese as liberators, or the Tibetans as splittists, or the Tibetans as resistance heroes. These are we're very familiar with this kind of level of discourse, and it's very prominent in current materials from anybody involved in writing about the Tibet issue. But that discourse level, and the scholars who've studied it, they're mainly studying the evolution of discourses decades after the events that they're referring to. So 1959 is the key event that these people are basically referring to, adding ideas to. We're seeing now 60, 70 years later how this is being framed. Currently, that's important. But we see very little discussion by scholars about how did those discourses originally emerge? How did they begin? And what were the actual triggers of their beginning? If we can disaggregate those triggers from the discourses that surround them. And that level of analysis is what Todorov called the histoire level of narrative. The primary events that are then emplotted, the word that those analysts use, into a specific sequence that makes a certain kind of sense, tells a certain story. And we're primarily interested in that histoire level, the initial construction in the very early moments after an event takes place or is reported, that see the first emergence of a kind of way of explaining those events. And one example of this histoire that we're very interested in, but we think we'll find others, is the explanation of the Chinese media operation. At the time in 1950, China entered into Tibet. The PLA arrived in 1950 and defeated the Tibetan army that October. At that time, the explanation, the histoire for that event in Chinese media was a liberation, a jiefang. And that's still the explanation now, that they liberated Tibetans. But the liberation, the jiefang in 1950 Chinese media was liberation from imperialists. They were liberating Tibetans from British and Americans. There were only actually 6 Westerners in Tibet at that time. So, but of course, the Chinese public would not have known that. But that was the rhetoric. And by 1956, 58, that explanation, that story began to change. The histoire shifted to still a liberation, but they began to say, we're liberating Tibetans from feudalism. Essentially, we're liberating them from themselves, from their upper classes and so on. This is because of a fundamentally important shift in Chinese policy from making an alliance with the elite in Tibet when they first arrived. They needed to. They had no Chinese there in Tibet, no roads, no Communist Party, no cells. So they made alliance with the elite. By the late 50s, they had roads, they had cadres, they had translators. They started to make their alliance with the, as they saw it, the masses. So we can see that reflected in that very early shift in the histoire level of discourse. So that's one example of what we're looking to find in this project. Can we, by going back to the early stages of the development of discourse, can we find the events that may have been overlooked now, that may have been lost subsequently, and the early stages of explanations for those events? I'm going to just finish my section by just saying this is experimental in a sense. This is a pilot project. This has not been done, the application of these tools or the reinvestigation of these very early discourses in the modern Tibetan context before. And it's difficult to do with modern Tibetan language. So we're halfway through seeing whether we will be able to succeed in this project. And this is really why we're interested in bringing you here today and the people online, to see whether we can get feedback from people, maybe some of you who have been able to do this with other areas of the world, other languages, other projects. That's why we're keen to do this initially with Marcus. I'm going to leave those thoughts with you now and hand over to Xaver, who's going to show us more precisely the materials we're working with and the methods we're developing for analyzing those materials. Xaver.
Okay. This is, yeah, so let me take over. So my name is Xaver Erhard. I'm from Leipzig, from Leipzig University in Germany, and I've been working on the material aspect, so to speak, of the project for the last 1.5 years, dealing with the newspapers. And so I would like to start with showing you or introducing you to the Tibetan newspaper landscape, and a little bit focusing on the evolution and on the political function of these Tibetan newspapers. The newspaper system in Tibet in the 1950s was still relatively young. The first Tibetan language newspaper, the Ladakh Akhbar, was published in 1904 by Moravian missionaries in Leh, the capital of Ladakh. And of course, being published by missionaries, the purpose of this newspaper was to spark Tibetan or Ladakhi interest in the ideas and concepts of Christianity. The first newspaper to appear in Tibet, or in central Tibet, in Lhasa, was the Tibetan Vernacular News, which you see here on the screen. And this was published in the final years of the Qing dynasty. And it targeted a Tibetan elite and tried to persuade the Tibetan elite to side with the Qing Empire against the whatever real or conceived growing influence of British India. Although you just said there were only few there, but the fear was great. So, and following the collapse of the Qing dynasty in 1912, during the period of the Republic of China, interestingly, there was no Tibetan language newspaper published in central Tibet or on, well, the territory of the Ganden Podrang government. All Tibetan language papers published were produced within China, for instance, in Beijing, but also in Chongqing and some other places, I believe. And on the south of the Himalayas, the Moravians still kept publishing newspapers in Tibetan language until the mid-1950s. But these were, of course, kind of limited to the missionary kind of context. However, these Moravian papers were by far less successful than the Tibet Mirror, which you see here, which was published in Kalimpong in West Bengal from 1925 to 1963. It is a well-known newspaper and probably the best researched Tibetan language newspaper so far. And it is also perhaps the first Tibetan language newspaper that that does fit the definition or the general definition of a modern newspaper, which first of all defines the criteria of universality. That means the newspaper has to cover a broad range of topics. Then the currency, the information should be up to date. So no old information should be published, but it should be something that is current at the moment. Fine. Then publicity. The newspaper and the information contained in the newspaper should be made available to a broad public audience. Usually this is done through subscriptions or selling the newspapers in shops or other ways. And then finally, periodicity. That means the newspaper should be published in some regular intervals, usually daily, weekly. Then in South and East Asia, I think every 10 days is a very common thing. But in the Tibetan context, we find very often monthly newspapers, which probably some very strict scholars of news would say this qualifies them as newspapers. But given the economic and also the geographic difficulties, Tibetan editors or newspaper faced on the Tibetan plateau, just sort of the sort of small population, huge territories, so it's difficult to distribute the newspapers, etc. So a monthly newspaper is probably still quite or carries quite current news for most readers. In any case, these four characteristics of a modern newspaper were only met in the newspapers of the 1950s and 60s. So all the other newspapers, with this exception of the Tibet Mirror, not really fit into these or not always kind of fulfill these categories. In the 1950s, then the situation changed and many more newspapers appeared. First in the PRC and later, after 1959, also in India. In our project, we tried to collect as many newspapers as we could sort of get our hands on. And for the period from 1950 to 1956, we were able to collect and scan a total of 18 newspaper titles for the project. The grayish kind of the newspapers on the bottom we excluded for practical reasons, mostly because these newspapers were in very bad conditions, so we couldn't do text extraction, or some were just like we had just a few copies and the content is not that relevant to include them. So we ended up with only 13 titles that we choose to further digitize. With the 5 titles we have from India, we could digitize almost all of the newspaper published in India from sort of after the flight of the Dalai Lama and the Tibetans to India in exile. So from 1959 onwards. Unfortunately, the 8 titles we have from the PRC only represent a relatively small fraction of the newspapers that have been published in the People's Republic during that period. The reason for this mainly is that many probably will not have survived, will not be preserved, and those newspapers that are preserved, we don't have access to easily. The first Tibetan newspaper that was published in the PRC was the Qinghai Tibetan News from Xining in Amdo. It was published in 1951. And then in the following 3 years, many more newspapers followed in all Tibetan regions of the PRC. So here you see a map of the Tibetan regions, or sort of the regions with like autonomous status for Tibetans. With the TAR being the biggest, but then Qinghai, Gansu, Sichuan, etc. And for all these 4, within all these 4 provinces and in the TAR, on each administrative level, newspapers were published in Tibetan language. So in the 50s, the PRC established a tight network of newspapers across the whole country. Not only in Tibet, but also in Tibet, in order to make sure that its messages reach all corners of the vast country. And these newspapers were organized in a strict hierarchy, and any organizational or editorial decisions required the approval of the respective higher administrative level. The entire production chain of publishing, printing, and distribution was centrally controlled by the Xinhua News Agency, which is obviously far more than just a simple news agency. And the subscription at times was compulsory for government employees, but also for institutions. And also these newspapers were read in evening reading sessions, where it was made sure that also those people who cannot read are familiarized with the content of these newspapers. And then in the discussions, it was made clear that everything was understood in the correct way. And China, here following the Soviet model, thus exercises what one can call positive control over newspaper publication. So the state or the party here maintained total control over the press through appointments of staff, through prescribing editorial plans, and then of course funding, and then also some post-publication evaluation. So if some newspaper office would publish something that is, well, not well received at higher levels, they would have to deal with consequences. So all aspects or all important aspects of the newspapers in economy, personal, and in content are controlled by the party or the state institutions. On the Indian side of the Himalayas, the number of newspapers naturally was much fewer, not only in titles, but also, of course, in absolute numbers of publications or issues printed. And the Tibetans in India had first settled in the area around Darjeeling and Kalimpong, just south of Sikkim. That is what is marked by this little red square on the map. And this area had long been a Tibetan, or had long seen a strong Tibetan presence. And it was actually a very important trade hub for the Indian-Tibetan trade. Also, well-off Tibetan families for a long time had sent their children there for English language education to the missionary schools in Darjeeling and Kalimpong. Moreover, the Tibet Mirror, which you just have seen, was also published there. And this is also the area where Gyalpo Thundrup, the older brother of the 14th Dalai Lama, first started his newspaper projects, initially with funding by the CAA. And this was started in 1960. And up until 1978, actually all Tibetan newspapers that were connected with the Central Tibetan administration were published in this area. The only exception is the Central Weekly News, a newspaper that was published by the Kuomintang office in Calcutta, starting in the early 60s and running probably in the mid 70s. So here you see the four, sort of besides the Tibet Mirror, the four main newspapers that were published in India in the early 60s. So to sum this up, although the newspapers in India seem at first sight a bit more diverse and independent, the Tibetan newspapers, with the sole exception of the Melong or the Tibet Mirror, were not fully independent and did not serve sort of the free exchange of ideas in the sense of a public sphere, but sort of rather represent sort of a mouthpiece of the Central Tibetan administration in India at the time. And so this is seen that they were all in a way institutionally controlled. So the Central Tibetan administration or some other in the Central Wiki News, it was sort of the party office of the Kuomintang. They controlled finances, they controlled the staff that was appointed, but they also controlled the content by making sure that it's that they do not publish something that is against sort of the agenda of this respective institutions. So what we deal here with, one could say, is either on the PRC side with the statist press, but on the Indian side, at least with a partisan press that kind of sort of supports some ideological position here. And as Robbie already had said, in terms of propaganda, this might be seen as something not very interesting, but we think through this, we can take these newspapers as semi-official documents, made public by these institutions. And so we can now study the various concepts, strategies, the interests of these institutions or administrations. So how would we like to study these? This brought us to sort of trying to, well, look what digital humanities tools are available and what digital humanities approaches might help us to study this. 15,000 pages at the moment we have collected, and which is obviously too much that we could, in such a small project, mainly consisting of the two of us. So we could not study that in a traditional way, that is, read through all these pages and make sense of each individual article or news item mentioned here. So to start with, in order to study this corpus of 15,000 plus pages, our goal is to have a newspaper corpus in the form of reliable e-texts and that means e-texts with a very high accuracy in order to eventually enable us, eventually enable us to do corpus mining, qualitative content analysis, or several other tasks after that. I'm saying that because if one talks to software engineers or digital humanities people, they're very often quite happy with like 80% or even 60% accuracy. But 15,000 pages is a rather small corpus, and if we miss out on 20% or even 40% of the information, that would be quite a bit. Also, it is high accuracy is also important because every mistake done during, for instance, OCR results in many more errors downstream for other tasks. So when dealing with this material, due to the sort of the material conditions of the material, we have I think we have three major challenges that we have to kind of deal with. First of all, it's not only 13 different publications we are dealing with, but it is also 3 different languages. So these newspapers, they contain obviously Tibetan, but then they also contain very often a lot of Chinese, and not only horizontal Chinese, but also vertical Chinese sometimes, especially in the earlier times. Then we have, the echo is gone. Yeah. And then we have also English, for instance. Occasionally we have some Hindi, etc. Very different, many different languages in different scripts. But also, even within these scripts, we have a great variation of different forms of these scripts. So we have print, and then we have cursive forms and different typefaces. And this all causes a lot of problems when trying to extract the texts. And finally, the publications also feature different layouts. So we have a multi-column layout, which is obviously for digitization more difficult than a single book page. And the main obstacle we have to master probably is that there are very, very few digital humanities tools available for working with Tibetan text, especially with modern Tibetan language and script. So to produce such a machine-readable e-texts, we adapted and developed some tools that are available and set up a digitization workflow that consists of mainly 3 steps or phases. And we start from the physical corpus of the newspaper, which we either get in paper or in microform. And then we take 3 steps in the digitization, text extraction, and finally, third, there is the corpus analysis. So digitization means the actual scanning and then doing some pre-processing. And then in the Transcribus platform, that's a platform for training models to transcribe handwritten text, actually. So we have several processes there. And then there's some post-processing before we feed these e-texts then in our corpus analysis tools, which is at the moment there are 2 tools we are hoping or we are using. One is the corpus mining tool, and the other one is a semantic search. And I would like to show you some of the issues we face in some more detail. So the whole process starts with compiling a corpus of physical newspapers from various sources, usually in the form of physical copies, but unfortunately also in microforms. And this often results in low quality scans, as you can see here. And since we do not have the possibilities to evaluate all of the images we get manually, we developed a pipeline that classifies the images into, well, a set of fair and a set of low quality images, and then processes them accordingly using 2 different binarization algorithms. And so the second image you can see here is the outcome of the first image. And the result may not be optimal for each and every image, but it is still good enough to ensure that we will be able to transcribe or extract most of the newspaper text in the following steps. So then we upload our pre-processed images in a tool called transcribus.org. It's a web application developed by the Innsbruck University in Austria, and in order for especially developed for transcribing handwritten material from archives, so handwritten letters, ledgers, etc. But it turned out to be quite good also for scripts that are not easily treated with state-of-the-art OCR tools. So after some early successes, we found that the complex layout of Tibetan newspapers, so you see here 4 columns and then some ornaments, etc., then the different font sizes, etc. This all created considerable problems for text extraction. And we tried to solve that by training 3 different models that must be applied on each newspaper page in a strict order. So first we trained a field model that helps us identifying and classifying text regions. That is what you see here, sort of the pink, red, and bluish squares. These are the text regions, and they can now be identified. And this helps us to see where the columns of the newspaper layout are. Then a second field model identifies the text lines in each of the text regions. You can see it with the newspaper title here, Tibetan Freedom. There's a small red line around it. That would be the line polygon for that text line. And then finally, our third model is the model that actually does the text recognition. And then this would look in each of these line polygons, whether it finds Tibetan or English or Chinese text there, and then transcribes it, as you can see it on the side here, into machine-readable text. And currently we are mostly struggling with the first model, which turned out to be the most difficult model to train, but with our text recognition model, we actually have like a 95 to 97% accuracy so far. So it transcribes a page with like 2 or 3 mistakes at the moment. Once this is done, we can download the text, do some post-processing and enrich the text with some metadata, normalize it, and then feed it to our next step, which is the analysis of our corpus using the 2 tools mentioned. First, the semantic search, and then the so-called ILCM, the integrated Leipzig corpus miner, a tool that was developed at Leipzig University to study whatever German and English newspapers for, and it's a tool that bundles several corpus mining tools, such as core currency analysis, topic modeling, supervised text classification, and others, with a very user-friendly interface that also people like the 2 of us can handle and actually sort of perform some of these tasks without being able to actually code. Again, there are a few challenges because the Leipzig corpus miner is dependent on SPACY, that is an industry standard natural language processing library, which unfortunately doesn't support Tibetan. So creating such a SPACY model for Tibetan again requires large amounts of training data, which do not exist for modern Tibetan. So lacking both funds and people in the project to produce such amounts of training data in a very short time. So our project is running for 3 years. And that should all be just preliminary steps, actually. So we thought we can use one of these new generative AI models, ChatGPT, Claude, Google Gemini, etc., and did sort of a short evaluation and found that most of them, or at the time, many of them were not able to do proper Tibetan. However, the more advanced tools, so ChatGPT still is not very good in Tibetan, but Google's Gemini Advanced was, at least I think 6 months ago, it was probably the best tool to handle any Tibetan. So we used it to produce all this training data and train the model for SPACY. In order to do real kind of inquiries, or in order to do what Robbie initially mentioned, the prosopography, so pinpointing people and tracing them over time, one would need a functionality called named entity recognition. And we are currently working at training a model, a SPACY model that has also this functionality. But as you can imagine, there are new challenges, and we are going through, again, through a similar process right now. In the end, the Leipzig corpus miner here, and this is a screenshot, can handle some Tibetan. Now you see here a page that shows some topic modeling. So the Tibetan words give you the 30 most salient words in the for the topic number. I can't see it, 14, 16 on the screen. And so you can see there is a small cluster of rather similar topics here, while topic number 17, 18, or 7, there would be much different topics. So we think, well, I have to say this is a different corpus. It's just like a very small corpus we got from the internet. And this is not our own corpus. We have not yet been able to upload. So we think this will give us some functionality that will allow to identify clusters of topics, themes, probably interesting for our research. The second tool then that we want to use is what we just refer to as semantic search. And it's a search engine that doesn't use only keyword search, but is vector-based. So we turned our corpus into vectors, embeddings, and this now allows us to search this whole corpus, but not based on a single keyword, but on the semantics represented by vectors in this corpus. The advantage, to keep it short, is such a vector-based search comes with two advantages, because it's a multilingual model behind that allows us to search the corpus using theoretically every supported language. So we can search our Tibetan corpus now using English sentences or Chinese sentences or Japanese sentences. We found that has not the same quality. So if you use Vietnamese, for instance, the results are not that good. But in English or Chinese, they're pretty reliable. And the second and more important advantage is if we search the corpus using this tool, we can search, for instance, for a keyword like ship, but the results returned will also include water transport, ferry, boat, sort of semantically close terms. So this will, or this would allow us to, have a better or yield better results on searches that are a little bit broader and thus do better represent maybe a discourse present in the corpus. So this is how this search would look like, and it's quite easy. You enter a lengthy search term, as here, just like a string of, well, keywords that kind of hint at a very contemporary issue: resettlement, poverty, elevation, etc. In an issue that was discussed in the last 15 years intensively in Tibet. And then it will bring back all these results from the Tibetan corpus. And we also implemented a simple machine translation using Bing that makes it even more easy to deal with the results. So one doesn't need to struggle with the Tibetan here. So what we hope that this will allow us to retrieve thematic clusters of topics, of narratives, or discourses that we would otherwise, or that would otherwise escape our attention. Okay, so in the remaining time, won't be too long, I would like to show you now one example of such a narrative that we are interested in, or that we could imagine we would be able to study more when we use our corpus. And that also combines or contains elements that otherwise would not be, otherwise can remain undiscovered. And this is a story, or maybe this is sort of done in a very traditional way by sort of reading a couple of months of newspapers published in the Amdo region of Tibet. So that's the Amdo region is kind of is Qinghai, but also includes part of Gansu and northern Sichuan. Sort of it's kind of a traditional regional term. And I was reading through 1 or 2 months only in a few newspapers of that time. So browsing through these newspapers from Amdo, I came across a very intriguing report published on the 17th January of 1959 in the Qinghai Tibetan News. And it was interesting because in all the papers I was looking before that, it was very surprising to see that they were really only publishing information, news, or instructions on agricultural development and how to advance it by using scientific technology or whatever was conceived as such at the time. But this one article kind of stuck out because it described the tragic fate of one Droma Jab who died in the Julag River in an heroic attempt to save 10 sheep of his people's commune. So it was a very kind of tragic and sentimental report. And what was really surprising about it, it was that this incident did not happen on the 17th January of 1959 or any time close, but it happened 3 months earlier, already in September 58. So why would you publish an old piece of news? So the report is really easy to, the story is located in Sijutang People's Commune in Julak County. So it's a very real county, and all the readers will be familiar with that county. And the person is also a real person, probably, that maybe some readers also know from this area. So it's a very kind of a local news item one could see. And well, Droma Jab sort of jumped into the river, which was described as raging, freezingly cold, high waves, etc., very dramatic. 5 other people followed him into the river, but he was still trying to catch all the sheep that were carried away. And then eventually he was also carried away, and the commune held a meeting memorizing his sacrifice. So directly next to this report is a commentary entitled "A Marvelously Good Character." And in this commentary, the behavior, or Droma Jab's self-sacrifice is described as a model behavior everyone should follow. Obviously not asking people to jump into rivers, but sort of to keep up sort of, or devote oneself to the well-being of the greater community. So what we have here is a reporting piece of a rather minor yet tragic incident in a place probably familiar to everyone who reads these newspapers. And the main figure is also well known, and his behavior now is modeled, is elevated to the status of a socialist model or a socialist hero even. And both report and commentary now establish a normative interpretation of this incident and selfless behavior. That is, the Communist Party and the commune's interest must always be put above personal interest or even one's personal life. And then next to this commentary and report, there is a third text which provides some context and also links this report to a larger sort of policy thrive at the time. And this is this illustration, and on the image, which is not very good to see, but you see a shepherd sort of feeding a yak, or rather a dree, a calf, and in the background there's also another dree, female yak, with another calf. And the subtitles explain the survival rate of yak calves has reached 95.76%, and many sheep gave birth to twins. So thus showing the success of collectivization at the time and the success of the policies, sort of the scientifically kind of enhancing agriculture. And the numbers given there relate to, the core agricultural policies, and show that sort of it also says that this shepherd is from the same commune, and sort of shows how kind of fulfilling these policies lead to a prosperous and happy and good life, economically good life in the commune. So at the same time, the report or the commentary or this set of news items seem to reveal some real or conceived problems at the time. Because in the second column, an apparently widespread behavior among Drokpa, that is the Tibetan pastoralists or nomads, is criticized. So many Drokpa, it reads, do not give everything for the commune, but selfishly care for their own personal interest. And these people must learn from Dromajab's example. So now I think again, or I remind you one more time that this is not a news story of some incident that happened yesterday, but more than 3 months ago. So why including such a piece of news item or such a set of news items of, well, you can say last year's old news? Obviously, we can't really tell, but some questions immediately come to mind. So could this be indicative of a failing of the collectivization policies at the time? Or is it indicative of some sort of public resistance to kind of implement the policies? Do the Drokpa try to escape these policies? Or could it be possibly even a warning that, well, now we are aware of that and we are going to implement them more strictly, these policies? Obviously, open question so far, but this is what that the kind of stories and the kind of little incidents we would hope to find in more news stories, or even be able to track kind of similar kind of stories in the texts. So what remains is some concluding remarks. Maybe, Robbie?
Maybe because of time, I'll hand straight over to Marcus.